my talk, which is best management practices for newly received calves. Like Jacqueline mentioned, I have been on the grand tour of North America, and actually just Canada and the US, in the last week and a half, and I think that I'm probably going to have a bit of a BRD outbreak here after all of this travel. So, receiving calves are not much different than us when it comes to that in terms of travel. A little bit of background on the University of Nebraska and our research capabilities and research feedlot. We are very blessed at the university to actually have 9,000 acres of pasture and cropland, in addition to our 3 different research feedlot facilities, all located just 30 miles from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And so we do have a lot of capability to do research. We have 23 graduate students right now who are all researching in the area of feedlot nutrition and a little bit on the backgrounding and cover crop side of things. So fortunately, I get to talk about a lot of the cool research that we do here. So traditionally, our yard was composed of a north and south yard that has 1,800 head. 138 pens that are about 10 to 20 head. And just in October of this last fall, 2024, we opened up the Klosterman Feedlot Innovation Center. So in addition to our north and south feed yard that had 1,800 head, we added an additional 2,200 head. So our grad students are pretty tired right now after almost doubling the amount of feedlot cattle that we have. Those cattle are largely northern type cattle. This year, because of cattle prices, we had to pursue some cattle from Oklahoma, Missouri, but largely northern type genetics within our feed yard. With that expansion, we put in more commercial sized pen research. So in addition to our 138 pens that are built for 10 to 20 head, we put in 9 60 head roller compacted concrete pens. If any of you have ever been in southeast Nebraska in the spring and summer months, we battle mud excessively. And so those concrete pens are hopefully going to help us out with that. An additional 9 60 head open dirt lot pens. And then we actually did put in 2 deep pitted slatted floor barns, which many of you from Ontario would be familiar with. Those again stocked at a stocking density of 25 square feet per head and 60 head per pen with 9 pens per barn. So we did do a monoslope roof and a gable roof. Our goal is to compare those 4 housing systems across within one geographic location. If you can believe it or not, that has really never been done on a larger scale. And so we are very interested to support the feed yard sector, both within the US and Canada, being able to do research, open dirt lot, RCC, and then in the barns. In addition, we did put in a 240 head barn with Incentec bunks from Hoco Farms, which would be very similar to Grow Safe bunks that many of you would be familiar with. A little bit different though is that these bunks send you a reading to your phone of how much feed that animal consumed, how many pounds of feed, and then can also kick that animal out of the system after they've consumed so much feed. So we could do limit feeding studies with those bunks. And from a grad student standpoint, these bunks actually dump themselves out. So the grad students don't have to go through and collect orts from those or waybacks from those bunks. So I think what's really critical, and I'm going to go quickly through the cow-calf side of things, but I'm sure we've got some cow-calf producers on the call as well. We can't really talk about receiving calf best management practices unless we talk about best management practices on the cow-calf side of things. And there's some good data that I really would like to touch on in that regard. So just in general, setting calves up for success on the cow-calf operation, generally vaccinated with 2 series, an initial and booster of clostridial and viral vaccine, weaned for 45 days prior to market, castrated and healed, dehorned and healed, and ideally exposed to feeders and waterers, which we would call bunk breaking those calves. The castrated and healed and dehorned and healed are so critical because once those calves get to the feed yard, any type of stressor on them, such as the stress of castration or dehorning, drops their immune system, which leads us to greater BRD pathogen outbreak. So I really want to quickly touch on what I see as the lowest hanging fruit within the cow-calf sector. And I usually just like to ask people what they think that that is, but because this is a webinar, I'll just go ahead and say my perspective of it. So I am a feedlot specialist, so I'm sure many of you can understand that I have a pretty big hot spot or sweet spot in my heart for growth enhancing technologies. But lately, I have gotten a lot of questions from the cow-calf side of things on suckling calf implants and if they should be using them or if they shouldn't be using them and how that actually impacts cattle in the feed yard. What is tried and true is that suckling calf implants have been around since, well, for the last 50 years. Ralgro just had its 50-year birthday. And the data that you go back and look at all the way back 50 years ago, those calves 50 years ago were putting on average 22 pounds a gain with a Ralgro. And today we just completed another feedlot study at UNL in a backgrounding phase giving Ralgro 22 pounds a gain. Pretty tried and true. And when 5-weight calves are bringing 420 last fall in Alberta, I'm from Alberta originally, so that's the markets that I keep up with. Why are you not going to take the advantage and gain that extra $80 on each calf? And so on average, we see an average daily gain increase by around 10% for a suckling calf implant. There are some extreme misconceptions around suckling calf and backgrounding implants that I really quickly want to debunk because I can't be a feedlot specialist unless I debunk these. So average body weight gain from a suckling calf or a backgrounding implant. So that can be anything from your Synovex C, your Ralgro, to your Revlor G, to a Synovex 1 grower. Anything that is approved for the backgrounding, suckling calf, or pasture phase. These are not potent implants. We have to keep this in mind, and we have to implant with potency based on stage of production. So I have seen a few implant strategies lately coming out of Western Canadian provinces from the cow-calf backgrounding side that make me question a little bit why we're utilizing more potent implants in earlier stages of production. I just want to really highlight that if there's a suckling calf or a backgrounding implant used in a suckling calf or a backgrounding phase of production, there will be no hindrance on marbling at the end of the feeding period. And we at UNL have looked into this now in quite a bit of depth and detail in terms of data that those suckling calf and backgrounding implants do not reduce the opportunity for compensatory gain opportunity in the feedlot phase. That being said, those implants must be chosen and selected for the correct stages of production. And when I say stage of production, energy of the diet has got to reflect what the implant being used is. And we can go into a lot more detail on this. You guys can get my email and we can discuss in more depth. But I just wanted to debunk this misconception because there is some questions on why we don't use suckling calf and backgrounding implants. I mean, there's only about a 30% adoption of a suckling calf implant in cow-calf producers in Canada and the US, and I just don't know why we leave 22 pounds of gain on the table. So you guys can probably understand where I'm coming from in that regard. That being said, any of you who market NHTC cattle, I am by no means telling you to get out of that marketing stream. But if you do not do the paperwork to market NHTC cattle or GAP cattle or all natural cattle, then I do not know why you are not giving an appropriate suckling calf or backgrounding implant. And I might get some comments in the chat from that, but that is where I stand on that. So in addition to the 22 pounds that you can get from backgrounding your calves, there's also a performance impact by preconditioning those calves with just 2 pre-vaccine, pre-weaning vaccines. And so this is some older data from 1997, but the data that you look at today still holds true on this. And for calves that were not given a pre-vac program versus calves that went through a 2 vaccine pre-vac program, there's a 16.5% improvement on average daily gain in those calves and an 8.5% improvement in feed conversion. So best management practices on cow-calf set you up for greater success on the feedlot side of it. And I don't ever want to talk about any type of management practices without showing a little bit of profitability. So this is an extremely well powered review that Merck Animal Health does in conjunction with Superior Livestock. Every year now they produce this data. And so what they do is look at all 5-weight lots sold in the US from January till December of whatever year. This is 2023 data that I'm going to show you. These are just 5-weight calves. So 900,000 5-weight calves, and here are the returns on those calves. If you sold a calf that had horns, you lost $17. Well, perhaps not lost, let's not say it that way. If your calf did not have horns, on average, you made $17 per head by selling that calf without horns. That doesn't mean that that calf didn't have horns when you had it on your operation. That means that you dehorned it before you sold it into the system. Then when we look at the implant opportunity, this is a US number, or with the exchange, obviously calf prices were much higher in Canada, but this was 2023 5-weight calf price, so $2.63, you left $60 per head on the table if you did not give an implant. The NHTC opportunity in the US for 2023 was $37 a head. So you, in this scenario, would have lost $20 by not implanting in that year. I realize that we are in a very unusual year, last 3 years, in terms of cow numbers and what calf prices have done. And so, like I mentioned earlier, if you currently are in an NHTC marketing program and have a good relationship with a buyer into those programs, do not ruin that relationship just to implant your cattle for these 2 years. But if you are not currently in an NHTC program and you believe that you are getting additional value by not implanting your calves, I would gladly have a conversation with you and gladly talk to your buyer about why there is a reduction in price on those cattle. Then when we talk about pre-vacking, I already showed you the nice 16% improvement in average daily gain, but there also is a dollar value attached to pre-vac programs. These are all Merck Animal Health pre-vac programs that are available in the US, but there are these same type of vaccine programs available in Canada. On average, if you gave 2 doses of Clostridial and 2 doses of modified live, and you marketed those calves as 45 days 45 days weaned, you are making an additional $7.86, almost $8 per hundredweight. So you are returning $40 per head on those calves, on those 5-weight calves. Now we're going to transition into what happens when that calf is leaving the cow-calf operation after hopefully we've done some best management practices on the cow-calf. So as you know, cattle have to travel a long way. In the United States, cattle travel from all the way in Florida and all the way in Montana to come to our major feeding area, which I don't know that I have my pointer on. Can you see my cursor when I do this on the screen?
Yes, we can.
Oh, perfect. Okay. So cattle are moving all the way from up here and down here to come into the 3 states that we call Feedlot Alley in the US. And that is near the Corn Belt. So Nebraska, where I am a professor at, Kansas, and then largely the Texas population, but only in the panhandle of Texas. So those cattle travel a long way. But you know who else travels a long way? Is Alberta to Ontario cattle feeding and all of those provinces in between or outside. And not to mention the hundreds of thousands of cattle that come across the border to be fed within the US or vice versa, US into Canada. So when those cattle get to their location, depending on where they're going and what marketing stream they came through, they're stressed, they're immunocompromised, and they are exposed. So we refer to the receiving into the feed yard as the receiving period, a 4 to 8 week period in which relocated cattle adapt to their environment. This is the most challenging time nutritionally and health-wise, which we've hit on BRD already in tonight's webinar, but I'll show you some more interesting information on it. But cattle may arrive in a catabolic state, and what catabolic state means is that they are utilizing their muscle tissue as an energy source. They are breaking down muscle glucose in order to try and fight off infection. They may have inflammation from marketing and transport, and stressors cause the immune system to suppress, which then increases pathogen replication, which for us just creates more of a challenge within that first 28-day period that animal's in the feed yard. So one big thing that some operations have talked to me about in the past is signs of anorexia right upon arrival. This is very, very common for newly received calves, and I don't want anybody to get too stressed out if that only lasts for 1 to 7 days. So there's been a lot of older data from 1986 that shows that very, very common in that first 7 days upon feedlot arrival that calf feds are going to have, they'll show symptoms of anorexia. That might be a body weight intake on a dry matter basis of 0.5 to 1.5%. Everything that I say is on a dry matter basis. So I know that we feed a lot of pretty wet rations in Ontario. So just to always consider everything's on a dry matter basis. And then that study was redone, or West Texas A&M looked at some of their receiving calves over the course of 2017 through 2018 and reporting on average about a 1.5% of body weight intake. So newly received calves can be highly stressed and anorexic in nature when they get to the feed yard, and this should not be a cause for concern. But if intakes are super depressed, that's when we have to make the decision, do you feed a higher energy diet or do you feed a higher roughage diet right upon intake, and will those animals eat? So after you get past that first week of a really depressed intake, this is pretty much our data at the university over the last 30 years summed up into how our percent of body weight intake on newly received calves has looked. So by week 2, those calves should be eating about 1.84% of their body weight on a dry matter basis. By week 3, 2.46%. By week 4, they should be rocking and rolling up to 3% of body weight. And if they are not, then you do need to evaluate what your nutritional strategy is and maybe look at what your receiving protocols were in terms of vaccination and BRD challenge and prevention. So for any of you that have deep dove into the literature on newly received calves, you can read 800 pages and be more, or 800 papers and be more confused about what your personal dogma is on newly received calves than what you were if you had only read 5 papers. And so that is where I've gotten myself into over the last year and a half, reviewing newly received calf work, and then also working on some newly received calf literature at UNL, is how do we manage health but optimize performance in newly received calves? So the biggest question is, do we feed a high enough roughage level to mitigate ruminal acidosis? Or do we try and increase the energy content of that diet a little bit, because every bite matters if they are showing symptoms of anorexia and have low feed intake? And I'm going to show you guys a plethora of data on all of this, but I just mentioned high enough roughage level to mitigate ruminal acidosis. And our biggest challenge is that a lot of cattle that get to the feedlot, we might incorrectly diagnose them with BRD, but they might be acidotic. And it's because many of those clinical symptoms are very, very similar in nature. And so at what point do we make the decision that we have enough roughage in the diet, that calf's actually intaking enough feed in order to battle any type of acidotic event, and that we aren't just having a BRD outbreak? So here is kind of, this is kind of the dogma, or the question that I'm going to be trying to discuss with you guys over the course of the next few minutes here. Do we start cattle on a higher starch diet at receiving, because that will improve performance in terms of average daily gain and feed conversion, but we also know that that increases morbidity or BRD outbreak, versus a lower starch diet at receiving, so think more roughage in the diet, which we know reduces performance in terms of average daily gain and feed conversion, and then it also reduces morbidity, which is positive for us. So just as a really quick review, the economic loss from BRD is quite dramatic, anywhere from $40 for cattle treated once, all the way up to $291 per head for cattle treated 3 times. And that's not the cost of the vaccine. That would be alarming. But that would be any type of performance losses over that animal's life. And you guys can see that that's 2002 data, so you guys can inflate that quite a bit to know what today's economics would look like. The biggest thing that I always try to drive home is that what happens to the calf early in their life is what they will perform like when they get to the feed yard and they get to end of life. And so early health challenges have lasting impacts. What I do want to point out is that average daily gain, when we compare steers that were not treated versus steers that were treated greater than one time differed by 21.6%, with steers that were treated one time being an intermediate of those two. Then when we look at hot carcass weight, steers that were treated no times had 14 pounds more hot weight than steers that were treated greater than one time for a BRD challenge. Then when we look at marbling, so marbling starts very early in life, actually in utero is when marbling starts, and we can negatively impact marbling at multiple different stages of production. Upon receiving into the feed yard, marbling can definitely be impacted by animal health. There's some older data that shows that as soon as an animal gets sick, they'll go off feed for anywhere from 5 to 10 days or reduce feed intake, and that is when marbling can be hindered. What we see here is that calves that were treated greater than one time have almost 30 points less marbling than calves that were not treated, and that can be the difference between getting a premium for marbling or getting a discount. I think upon arrival, the first step for everyone should be to do a risk assessment on those cattle to determine the magnitude of stress that was encountered, but also the likelihood for BRD development. Often we'll have feed yards that have this discussion with their buyers, which I know is common for most. But it is critical too, once those cattle get to the yard, to do your own assessment of them, because the risk that they look like at the auction barn or at the direct backgrounding or cow-calf operation may be different than the risk that they are now that they've shipped and commingled and are in your yard. So we break those into 3 risk classifications, which we've already heard of tonight, but want to talk about the little high risk guy right here. He's coming into the yard a little bit lighter. Looks like he has a bit of a vitamin A deficiency. That's why he's blind and wearing glasses. Then the guy in the middle, he's coming in maybe has a snotty nose, isn't really performing as well. He's not just medium risk because he's a Charolais. My family, we have a large continental population on our operation, so I always get the flack for being a Charolais girl, but they can turn and burn. They do some good things in the feedlot, lots of gain. And then the low risk cattle, which according to ChatGPT kind of looks like it's a beef on dairy animal, but we would not classify those as low risk. So for today's purposes, that's a Simmental Angus cross. And so I think it's very, very critical that we do assign a risk to these animals, because that is how we're going to determine how we manage them for the remainder of the feeding period. So in general, calves that spend multiple days in the marketing chain, so maybe they they were marketed through the auction system, then they had to layrage over on the trucking haul, and now they got to your operation. They're often going to develop BRD a little bit sooner or show some type of symptom of illness for us, whereas calves that are direct source, maybe we need to be checking those pens a little bit more in 2 to 4 weeks after arrival. So I took this picture in an auction barn 2 weeks ago, and what's unfortunate is obviously this guy was not having his best day. You can see him super, super high-sided on the left. He actually, if I would have taken a picture of him from behind, he kind of looked like the Michelin Man, just on his stomach only, on very, very tiny legs, and he could hardly walk. He needed some serious help, and the auctioneer actually said, this guy needs a new manager. And I was surprised that anybody even bid on him in all reality, but his cohorts that he was sorted off from brought $2,200 for a 7 weight, and he brought a nice $209. So assessing your risk before purchasing is very, very critical. Somebody obviously was taking the risk on him because the likelihood that he actually survived to his destination to be fed is pretty low. But if he had survived, first things first, upon feedlot arrival, your goal should always be to get food in them and to get water in them. As soon as you can offer water to those cattle, you're going to set them up for more success than if you were to just keep them in a pen for multiple hours and not have enough feed or water in that pen. So many calves have not been bunk broke before, or maybe they've not been around fermented feeds before. So if you know that they've never ever been around a fermented feed stuff, I would somewhat discourage utilizing silage or a fermented feed or having high moisture corn in the diet right upon receiving, because those calves The smell and the difference in flavor of fermented feeds kind of turns them off a little bit. They will eventually come to love it and appreciate it because it's palatable for them, but at the very beginning, it can make them push back off feed a little bit. So having familiar feedstuffs in that first 7 days is pretty critical, again, to bunk break those cattle. We always say that high quality roughages don't have a place in the feed yard. And that is true for the finishing phase, but right upon arrival, high quality forages are important to get adequate energy into the diet when their intakes are depressed. So if I have a calf who's really exhibiting signs of anorexia and he's only eating 0.8% of his body weight on a dry matter basis, I want to make sure that the forages that I am giving him or the feed that I'm giving him is going to help him along and offer him nutrients. I'm probably not going to do too well on a calf who's only intaking less than 1% of his body weight if he's just going directly into the yard on corn stalks as his roughage source. Targeting 16 to 18 inches of bunk space has been shown. More bunk space, better receiving for calves, better opportunity for performance, and better more or reduced morbidity, sorry. I realize 16 to 18 inches of bunk space is difficult to achieve in every feed yard. But if they can all be up at the bunk together, they're going to eat more than if some of them, if only, let's say 50% of the pen could have fit up at the bunk at one time. We're going to get into step-up diets a little bit because obviously they're critical within the feed yard. The main goal is to increase energy over the course of the feeding period. So increasing concentration, reducing roughage, and we're allowing the calf's rumen to adjust to changes in the diet. But what is a bit of a misconception is that a lot of people will say that we are trying to retrain the rumen bacteria to learn how to eat from a roughage to a grain diet. But rumen bacteria can figure it out pretty fast. Populations can become dormant, and other populations of rumen bacteria can flourish within a 10-hour span, whereas that calf that we're asking to eat a much bigger bulk of feed or a much higher energy feed, it's actually we're training the calf more than we're training the calf's rumen. And then because I know Ontario feeds a lot of byproducts, just as we do in Nebraska, holding byproducts constant through that step-up diet has shown for us to be the most successful in terms of receiving. So when we're asking an animal to adapt to a feed stuff that, originally they come in ready to eat roughages, that's most likely what they have been eating prior to when they're arriving to your feed yard. And we're asking them to go from eating high roughage to a high grain diet, let's say over the course of 28 days, might be shorter depending on what intervention strategies you use. But we're asking them to move from gut fill, which is truly the bulk within the rumen that's making them feel full, all the way to an energy limitation, which we call chemostatic fill or chemostatic energy limitation, which is not well defined in literature, but it's essentially they're feeling full because there's more energy in the diet. In general, an adaptation period lasts 18 to 28 days, and we decrease 10 percentage units in roughage maximum on each step. Your goal is to keep cattle full and non-aggressive during transitions. So if you are on step 2 and you're waiting to determine if you want to move on to step 3 of your step-up diet, if you do not have, or if the bunk is slick clean, you are more than likely behind those cattle. So you either need to increase the amount of feed or you need to transition onto your next step. And like I mentioned earlier, mistakes can last the entire feeding period and you can hurt the rumen, and that rumen, the burning of that ruminal papillae with acidosis can then create challenges and metabolic challenges for your animal all the way down the line essentially onto the gut table at the plant with the liver abscess. So here's an example step-up period. This is one that we've done quite a bit of research on at the university, but also I would like to add, this slide was created for 2 days ago at Western Canada Feedlot School. What we would typically do would be maybe a 35% roughage, and then we would be, let's say, a 40% grain So we could start with that 20% byproduct in the diet. Typical byproducts of Nebraska cattle feeding would be wet distillers grains, modified distillers grains, or dried distillers grains. And then in addition, wet corn gluten feed or sweet bran, marketed by Cargill, very, very common in most Nebraska diets. I have, it's very rare that I see a diet in Nebraska, a step-up diet, especially that does not have some type of byproduct in it, and especially a wet byproduct to try and hold all that roughage together in the diet. And again, these are all on a diet dry matter basis. It's funny when I have a producer tell me, well, I'm feeding 60% corn silage in the diet, so that's got to be enough. And I'm like, yes, but is that on an as-fed or a dry matter basis? Well, that's on an as-fed basis. Well, silages or wet distillers grains or wet corn gluten feed, you always have to remove the water in order to know truly how much roughage you are getting into those cattle. You might notice that my total days on each step, oh, that first step only has 5 days, and then I move to 777 before they get on finisher. The most critical thing that we always talk about at the University of Nebraska is this step. The last step before the finisher is the most critical step in alleviating ruminal acidosis, because those cattle at that time are on the highest grain that they've ever been on, and that is when you are at the most risk of having an acidotic outbreak or an acidosis challenge within your cattle. Calf protein intake as a percent of diet dry matter. What I love is that Ontario cattle feeders can also price in distillers grains, which, as many of you would know, distillers grains have a high rumen undegradable protein content, which is exceptional in terms of talking about the success and the growth ability of calves. So if a calf is eating 1% of body weight, essentially, these are your protein as a percent of diet dry matter that you should be trying to target. So essentially what it is if that calf is intaking more feed, you can provide less protein within that diet. Because you guys have the opportunity in Ontario to price in distillers grains and other byproducts that are high in protein, about 30% protein, we rarely are not limited on protein in calves or in yearlings or finishing cattle. But when you do not have those high protein byproducts in the diet, that's often when I do make sure that at least you're in a receiving calf diet, you must have at least minimum 12% in there of protein. Otherwise, those calves are just not getting the protein that they need in order to actually build a frame and continue to build muscle and be able to end at the end point of 1,500 plus pounds that you're asking them to end at now. I'm not going to come, even though I am a ruminant nutritionist, I'm not going to come on here and talk to you guys a whole bunch about organic trace minerals, but I do want to show you this one study that was recently published out of Iowa State. Dr. Stephanie Hansen, maybe some of you have heard her speak before. She is pretty much the queen of trace minerals. And so there's been a lot of talk on the value of organic trace minerals, specifically during receiving. Number one, because if the intakes are depressed or that calf is more stressed, we do want to make sure that the bioavailability of those trace minerals is more available. If they are not eating as much, you want to make sure that every single bite counts. So what they did was over a 42-day receiving trial, they compared inorganic, organic, and organic plus zinc trace mineral programs. And as you can see here, the average daily gain was improved by about 0.3 pounds per day for the organic over the inorganic. And then feed conversion was also better for those cattle, as there was no difference in dry matter intake. And as you can see here, organic and organic plus zinc were not different significantly from each other, but again, both better than the inorganic. So that's all I'm going to say about trace minerals. You guys can email me, we can discuss in more detail, but the Hansen lab out of Iowa State has an exceptional amount of organic versus inorganic and the importance of zinc in newly received calves. And Steph also just published a paper, a really good paper, on the importance of zinc during transportation. And so of receiving calves. So zinc in the diet at arrival, but then also to support them for any type of growth enhancing technologies. So the most important nutrient for life is water, and water intake drives feed intake. And so there was an old dogma years ago that a really wet ration would increase the opportunity for ruminal acidosis. And that was not because of the water content of the diet. That dogma was actually because we just didn't really understand the starch value of high moisture corn at that time. But the wetter, the better when it comes to rations. Obviously not in the first 7 days when you're trying to get a newly received calf onto a diet. But once we get up into that final step and into the finishing period, the wetter, the better. When we talk about water intake, we do need to target 1 to 3 inches of water space per head. And the more that I have interest in water and water management and water quality and intake in a feed yard, I'm looking toward doing some research in that area in our new facility. But our water metrics and understanding of needs of water in cattle are very limited. And so we go by the 1 to 2 gallon per 100 pounds of body weight that was recommended years ago. And it seems to allow us to set up our water tanks, et cetera, to provide the right flow rate and make sure that our wells are deep enough to provide the water needed in the yard. But I think that there's a lot of value in water research and water understanding, especially in terms of how it impacts different diets and different stages of production. So targeting 1 to 3 inches of water space for newly received calves is like the gold standard recommendation. But I realize that there are very few operations that probably have 3 inches of water space per head. So what I have seen is guys will drag in one of the mobile water tanks, like water basins that we use during really hot summer months. And they'll drag that into the feed yard pen and put it about parallel around the outside of the pen, so that when the newly received calves are doing their NASCAR laps around the pen, they'll run into the water tank so that they actually are, oh, hey, I'm supposed to drink from this water. Now I know that I have this water. But it also increases your space, water space per head. But like I mentioned, not a lot of work done in actual water space needs, and looking forward to doing some of that at University of Nebraska. So like I mentioned, calves may need to be oriented to where the water tank is, and some will allow the tank to overflow for short periods. That is one thing that I wanted to mention is I know when I left Saskatoon yesterday morning, it was minus 35 Celsius. And so I know there was guys breaking waters at that weather temp, but the most critical thing that you can do for your cattle is make sure that they have water. It's more important than often getting feed into the bunk around the same time. Making sure that they have water is so important. It is the most essential nutrient for life, and cattle can go without feed for a lot longer than they can go without water. And just like you and I wouldn't want to drink this water, they don't want to drink it either. So finding feed yard employees who are willing to scrub waters is very critical. I'm not going to get too into the weeds on initial processing because I am not a veterinarian, nor do I aspire to be a veterinarian. So just talk to your veterinarian about best management practices for you. But it's often recommended to allow cattle 12 to 24 hours after delivery before processing. And then we obviously do all these other management strategies around that time as well. The most common viral and clostridials that are utilized within the US upon receiving, pretty much the entire industry vaccinates against BVDV, IBR, and then obviously BRSV, PI3, and giving a clostridial vaccine has become increasingly popular upon arrival. So I want to talk about field observations that we have for newly received calves and kind of where some of our ideologies have come from. So the first 3 that are highlighted here are ones that do not have a lot of, well, 2 of them are more so anecdotal in nature. One of them has a lot of data on it. So providing a lead animal, which many of you might have heard of this strategy before, could be a yearling animal or a cow penned with the new arrivals. There's been very limited actual research in this area, but Dr. Gibb in 2000 put a trainer cow in the pens with newly received calves, and it had no impact on morbidity of those calves, but it actually reduced the average daily gain for the calves early in the feeding period, just for a very short period of time, because the cow was consuming their feed. And so, and maybe they, they didn't want to compete with the cow or whatever it was, but that's pretty much the only research that's actually been done in that area. There's a few other studies on that, but they kind of all say the same thing. And then I have seen it increasing more. Actually, I saw it in Minnesota. I was there a few months ago in a few yards, and short fencing pens. So the pen is created to be obviously stocked at a large density, but what they do is they'll move the back fence line up to keep calves tighter to the bunk so that they can't uh, you know, leave the bunk and go as far all the way down to the bottom of the pen before they kind of know how to eat and know how to eat from the bunk. So that is one strategy that can be utilized for bunk breaking calves. Mass medication, I'm not really going to get into metaphylaxis. It's done a lot for our industry since 1990, but as we talk more about antimicrobial resistance, etc., I think it's so critical to discuss with your veterinarian what's best for your operation, but what's best for your risk status of cattle. If you are feeding a whole bunch of low-risk calves, I would truly have the discussion with your veterinarian about what is best for your operation. Okay, now these next three are things that we have looked at the University of Nebraska. So one of the recommendations is if you have the opportunity, which I know we have a lot of farmer feeders in Nebraska, there is in Ontario as well, if you can receive your cattle into the feed yard and maybe give them their processing or do the initial processing on those calves and then kick them out to grass for either 25 to 40 days or wheat pasture, whatever you want to do, what has been shown is that the morbidity levels of those cattle reduces. So what we did at UNL was brought in a whole bunch of freshly weaned calves. We did the initial processing on those calves, got their initial body weight, and then we sent them out to, well, half of them to pasture, half stayed in the feedlot. And the ending body weight of those calves was obviously considerably less, about 35 pounds less for the pasture calves in order, or compared to the feedlot calves, or about a 1 pound reduction in average daily gain per day. But the BRD challenge in those calves, or the BRD, or percentage of calves that were treated for BRD, was 11% in the feedlot versus 7.4% for the pasture calves. So what we know is that if you can kick those calves out on the grass, they're going to be healthier, but you are going to see that reduction in average daily gain. One limitation about the receiving calf studies that we do at the University of Nebraska is that we'll receive 2,500 head, do all these really, really cool receiving calf studies with them for the receiving period of, let's say, 40 days, 28 to 40 days. And then those calves were all brought back in, they're re-randomized, they're stratified by body weight, and they'll go on to 5 different research trials that are finishing cattle research trials, whether that's nutrition or implants, etc. So we personally do not have a lot of start to finish work on just how advantageous it is, or if those pasture calves can catch up to the feedlot cattle through the course of the finishing period. But as many of you know, there is compensatory gain once you pull calves in off of grass. And so often you will see that bump in feedlot performance once those pasture calves get in and they're feeling pretty good. So their intakes are usually pretty good. Just the impact of reducing sickness in the feed yard. This is some older data from Gardner in 1998, but it is still tried and true. In comparison to having to treat no times to greater than 1 time, your average daily gain reduction between the two is about 10% difference. So there is a lot of opportunity to improve average daily gain by making calves or by treating calves less within the feed yard. Keeping in mind that this receiving calf study was just strictly BRD outcomes on those receiving calves, not for what pertained through the rest of the feeding period. Okay, diet evaluations. Higher roughage, less pulls. I'm sure a few of you have heard that before. This is a meta-analysis that comes out of New Mexico State. It is Rivera and others in 2005 reviewed 6 different receiving calf strategies with differing levels of roughage in the diet. The roughage used was alfalfa hay in this in this study. So this is just strictly roughage inclusion. We're not talking about roughage quality in this study. We are talking about roughage inclusion. It is well documented that as you increase roughage in the diet up to, let's say, 50% on a dry matter basis, your morbidity reduces as you increase that roughage. That being said, as you increase that roughage in the diet, this is the exact same scale. As you guys can see here, roughage on the diet is on the x-axis. When you look at the y-axis, average daily gain is the exact same thing. As you increase roughage in the diet, you get worsened performance or a reduction in average daily gain. But that begs the question, what is your operation struggling with? Do you have really phenomenal pen riders and cowboys that can identify illness early and reduce your BRD incidence? Or do you have really talented feed truck drivers and feed callers and bunk callers that can identify when nutritional changes need to be made in the yard? And then you can kind of identify whether you're more performance focused or more animal health focused in your yard. And then you can kind of make the management decisions based on that. So I do want to touch on roughage quality because I've asked, so this is like the fourth time in the last 2 weeks that I've talked about receiving calf health. And so when I ask the question about roughage quality, I often get the response, it's the value of the roughage in the diet. And I'm like, okay, but what deems value? And so when we talk about quality of anything, usually we're talking about the feeding value. When we talk about the feeding value of distillers grains, wet distillers grains, we say it's 130% the feeding value of corn. So when we talk about roughage quality, we are often talking about the energy value that's assigned to that roughage, not the quality of that roughage in reducing, or the ability of that roughage in reducing ruminal acidosis. So I picked a few feedstuffs here that are commonly used in receiving diets. So corn silage, barley silage, brome hay, alfalfa hay, and oat hulls. When we look at the TDN, or total digestible nutrients, you can see that corn silage here is king, followed by barley silage, because those two bring energy to the diet. Then when we look at brome hay, it's not quite keeping up with the other ones and has a lower TDN value. So we know that it has less roughage quality, or it's a lower quality roughage. If I threw corn stalks on here, a low quality roughage. Oat hulls, lower quality roughage. I think you guys get the point that I'm trying to make. The less starch in it, the less feeding value essentially. Then when we look at neutral detergent fiber, just like you and I, the reason why we would eat roughages such as lettuce or other green leafy vegetables, broccoli, they all have a fiber value to them. And the same holds true for our hays and alfalfas and oat hulls. Anything that has a higher NDF percentage on a dry matter basis means that it has more fiber associated with that. So we do not deem roughage quality based on a fiber basis. We base it, roughage quality, on a TDN or energy basis. And then as you guys can see for yourselves, different crude protein value in those products, but usually we're not bringing in roughage in order to add a lot of protein to the diet outside of alfalfa. So roughage quality and health. Now let's talk about actual energy, okay? Roughage energy. In general, what is seen in literature is that higher quality or higher energy roughages, such as alfalfa hay that was utilized in this study, have improved performance. And you can see that tried and true right here. Your average daily gain for the calves that were on a 30% alfalfa hay, these calves were on a receiving diet for 35 days on feed. 132 steers were divided into the two different treatments. And what happened was average daily gain increased for the calves that were on the higher quality or higher energy diet, but morbidity also increased for the calves that were on a higher quality or higher energy diet. Then when we look at 30% cottonseed hulls in the diet, which we say is a lower quality roughage, but has higher NDF or fiber content, the average daily gain was reduced, but the morbidity was also reduced. So the question is always, what is your end goal? Is your end goal to grid a whole bunch of your cattle and get absolute high premiums for marbling? You know, really target that average daily gain, feed conversion, whatever your opportunities are within your yard? Or is your goal or your best management to to maintain or reduce illness within your yard. And this is always the receiving calf dogma. There's hundreds of papers published in this area that is always a dogma. You either have to choose this higher quality roughage that improves performance but drives a little bit higher in morbidity, or a lower quality roughage that reduces morbidity and drives and reduces performance. Okay, we'll end with a study that we just wrapped up at the University of Nebraska. So limit feeding calves, is this healthier? Or does it just make it easier to find and treat cattle? So this is one of our PhD students, Dr. Becky Funk. She just recently completed her composite exam, so we're very excited for her, but she also is a veterinarian. She's been a practicing feedlot vet for, 17 years. And so Becky has done a lot on the receiving calf area, and this study was no exception to that. So we set out to answer the question, is it better to limit feed calves upon feedlot arrival, or is it better to offer ad libitum feeding? And so what we did was we took the same diet, which was a third, and a third essentially, of grass hay, dry rolled corn, and sweet bran, wet corn gluten feed. And we either limit fed those calves on that same diet at 2.2% of initial body weight on a dry matter basis for 28 days, or we ad libitum fed those calves, and those calves were fed according to the bunk call. So they're either limit fed or ad libitum feeding, as much feed as they want. The pen riders observed the cattle 2 to 3 hours post feeding so that they would be blind to treatment, because if any of you know, if you limit feed calves for a long number of days, the ones who are not feeling good, if they're not coming up to the bunk and they're limit fed and they're not eating the amount that they want to eat and they're not coming up to the bunk, you can pretty much deem that one an illness at the back of the pen. They're not feeling good if they're not coming up to the bunk. So the pen riders would ride through the cattle 2 to 3 hours post feeding and then make the pulls. What we did observe, which is pretty much well tried and true in receiving calf performance, is that calves who are ad libitum fed or fed as much as they want based on bunk calls gained 24 more pounds in that 28 days on feed than the calves that were limit fed. As you can see, they had about a 4-pound increase in dry matter intake, or sorry, a 5-pound increase in dry matter intake. Their average daily gains were almost 0.8 pounds greater, and then they had a little bit worse in feed conversion. When we talk about BRD incidents during that first 28 days on feed, we actually did not pick up a significant difference. We found a 16.3% pull rate for the ad libitum calves based on BRD pulls, and a 14.4% pull rate on limit fed calves. So essentially what our conclusion was is that when you limit feed calves, we know that there is not an advantage in terms of performance, but is there an advantage of being able to identify those sick calves in the pen earlier? And there is some other research going on, and a second round of this study that went on that we've not published yet, that would really conclude that the opportunity for limit feeding cattle is that if you're trying to train a feed yard cowboy how to pull 6, you go and you watch that pen after feeding, and who does not come to the bunk within that first hour after being limit fed are the calves that you need to be paying attention to. So there is value in limit feeding cattle, especially if any of the limitations within your yard are on the animal health side of things, but you are going to give up performance, which is very, very well understood within literature and very well replicated in literature. So in summary, to wrap this up, you need to assign a risk status to your cattle, offer feed and water on arrival, and then of course determine profitability. So what makes sense for your operation? Are you targeting increased performance? Or are you having more of a morbidity challenge and you need to start targeting morbidity improvements? So making management decisions that fit your operation. I do want to just show some resources that we have at the University of Nebraska. So every year we publish a Nebraska beef report, and that can be found online literally by Googling 2025 Nebraska beef report, and then all the Nebraska beef reports from previous years will show up as PDFs. We put that out. That is all of the research that we do at the University of Nebraska, beef cattle related. On average, we do about 20 nutrition strategies a year across the University of Nebraska system. So there's a lot of research going on. And as you guys know, we love feeding corn silage and distillers grains. So we are pretty much on par with all of you in our feeding strategies. And so a lot of our research could really become helpful up into your feeding operations. So Nebraska Beef Report is where it's at. You can also follow us at UNL Feedlot on Instagram and Facebook, and that's a QR. If you just scan that QR code right now, it should take you there. I run those Facebook pages or those social media pages, and so I try to do little snippets of what we find in the beef reports and just be like, here's the high level responses. I should mention those beef reports are written for producers. So they are written as an extension of Nebraska Extension, and the goal is to make it make sense for producers. So don't worry, you're not going to be reading Journal of Animal Science 12-page articles. These are like 3-page condensed articles that are just going to tell you what the high level points are about the research that we found. There's my LinkedIn on the other side if anybody wants to connect with me.